I was folding tiny onesies in the nursery when I heard my mother-in-law's voice drift up from the kitchen below, crystal clear through the baby monitor I'd been testing. "You need to convince her to get rid of the baby, Jonas. 8 months is cutting it close, but it's not too late. I know someone who can handle it quietly." The soft cotton sleeper slipped from my hands as her words hit me like a physical blow. My 8 months pregnant belly pressed against the changing table as I gripped its edge, the room spinning slightly as the full meaning sank in. She was talking about my baby. Our baby. The child I'd been preparing for, dreaming about, feeling kick and move inside me for months. The conversation continued below, my husband's voice joining in, though I couldn't make out his words through the roaring in my ears. I stood frozen in that powder blue nursery, surrounded by the careful preparations of months. The crib I'd assembled myself when Jonas was traveling for work, the mobile I'd spent hours choosing, the rocking chair where I'd imagined countless midnight feedings. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was hearing this betrayal through a baby monitor, a device meant to protect and nurture, while holding clothes meant for the child someone wanted me to eliminate. My name is Sarah Walls-Martinez, and at 32 I thought I'd learned to read people pretty well. I'm a forensic accountant for a mid-sized firm in downtown Seattle, the kind of person who spends her days untangling financial deceptions and following paper trails to their ugly conclusions. I'm methodical by nature, patient, and I've built a reputation for finding the truth, even when people desperately want it buried. My colleagues often joke that I could find a discrepancy in a penny candy purchase, but there's nothing funny about discovering that those same skills I used to protect my clients' interests might be needed to protect my own family. The pregnancy hadn't been planned, but it hadn't been unwelcome either. Jonas and I had been married for 3 years, together for 5, and while we'd talked about children in abstract terms, we'd never set a timeline. When the positive test appeared, we'd been surprised but quickly embraced the idea. I'd assumed our families would share that joy, especially since this would be the first grandchild on both sides. I'd been particularly touched by how involved my mother-in-law, Patricia Martinez, had seemed in the pregnancy. She'd attended doctor's appointments, helped pick out paint colors, and seemed genuinely excited about becoming a grandmother. Now, standing in that nursery with her words echoing in my head, I realized how thoroughly I'd been deceived. The woman who'd spent months cooing over ultrasound photos and discussing baby names was the same woman downstairs suggesting I terminate my pregnancy at 8 months. The casual way she'd said it, the matter-of-fact tone suggesting she knew someone who could handle it quietly, made my skin crawl. This wasn't a panic suggestion born of momentary fear or concern. This was calculated, planned, delivered with the confidence of someone who expected to be obeyed. I forced myself to breathe slowly, one hand instinctively moving to my belly where my daughter, we'd found out the gender just 2 weeks ago, was currently practicing what felt like soccer moves against my ribs. The movement grounded me, reminded me what was at stake. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about the tiny person who trusted me completely, who depended on me for everything, who couldn't defend herself against the threats being casually discussed one floor below. I moved carefully away from the monitor, not wanting to miss any more of the conversation but needing to process what I'd already heard. Patricia's voice continued, something about financial considerations and your career. But the words blurred together as my mind shifted into the analytical mode that had served me so well professionally. If Patricia was willing to suggest something this extreme this casually, it wasn't her first time. People don't just spontaneously develop the connections and knowledge required for what she was proposing. This had to be part of a pattern, a history I'd been too trusting to see. My phone was in my hand before I consciously decided to record, muscle memory from years of documenting financial irregularities taking over. I activated the voice recording app and placed the phone on the dresser near the monitor, ensuring it would capture whatever else was said. Evidence first, emotional processing later. Another lesson from my professional life that was proving unexpectedly relevant to my personal one. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if sensing my distress. I whispered softly to her, a promise I meant with every fiber of my being. I'm going to protect you, little one. Whatever it takes, I'm going to keep you safe. The determination in my own voice surprised me. In the space of 10 minutes, I'd gone from contentedly preparing for motherhood to strategically planning how to defend my child against her own family. But as I stood there in that carefully prepared nursery, listening to my mother-in-law plot my baby's demise, I felt something shift inside me. A steel resolve I'd never accessed before, powered by maternal instincts I was only just discovering. The conversation downstairs was winding down, voices moving toward the front door. I heard Jonas agreeing to think about it, and Patricia reminding him that time is of the essence. Their casual goodbye hugs and Patricia's cheerful, "Give Sarah my love," as she left would have been surreal if I hadn't spent years watching people compartmentalize their deceptions. By the time Jonas's footsteps started up the stairs, I was back to folding baby clothes, though my hands shook slightly as I worked. "Hey babe," he said from the doorway, his voice carefully casual. "How are you feeling?" Patricia stopped by to drop off that baby book she mentioned. He held up a book I'd never heard her mention, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. I looked at my husband of 3 years, the man I trusted with my future, my security, my heart, and wondered how long he'd been lying to me. The worst part wasn't that he was lying. It was how naturally it came to him, how effortlessly he delivered that false warmth while the echo of their conversation still rang in my ears. I smiled back, a calm, serene expression that cost me everything to maintain. "That's sweet of her. I'm feeling good. Just getting some organizing done while I have the energy." I held up a tiny pink sleeper, the one I dropped when Patricia's words first hit me. "I can't believe she'll be here so soon." The irony of discussing our daughter's impending arrival with the man who'd just been strategizing how to prevent it wasn't lost on me, but I kept my voice steady, my expression loving. Something flickered across Jonas's face, guilt, maybe, or calculation. "Yeah," he said, then cleared his throat. "Actually, I was thinking maybe we should talk to Dr. Reynolds about options. Make sure everything's going to be okay." The careful way he phrased it, the same measured tone Patricia had used, confirmed what I'd already suspected. This conversation had been orchestrated, planned, rehearsed. I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his suggestion for the first time. "Of course. Whatever you think is best." I turned back to the dresser, ostensibly to continue organizing but really to hide the calculation in my own eyes. If they wanted to play games, I'd play games. But I'd play to win, and I'd play by rules they didn't even know existed. Truth is, I wasn't surprised by Patricia's betrayal, not entirely. Over the past few months, as my pregnancy progressed and became more visible, more real, I'd noticed subtle changes in her behavior that I'd explained away at the time but now seemed ominous in retrospect. The way she'd started asking pointed questions about our finances, whether we could really afford a baby right now. How she'd begun making comments about my career, wondering aloud whether I'd be able to maintain my professional standing while raising a child. The articles she'd started forwarding about the challenges of working mothers, the statistics about career derailment, the think pieces about women who'd sacrificed everything for children. At first, I'd assumed she was trying to be helpful, maybe working through her own concerns about becoming a grandmother. Patricia had always been involved in our relationship, sometimes to an uncomfortable degree, but I'd attributed that to her being a single mother who'd raised Jonas alone after his father left when he was 10. She'd sacrificed a lot for him, worked multiple jobs to keep him in good schools, and been fiercely protective of his opportunities. When we'd first started dating, she'd been skeptical of me. I wasn't from their social circle, didn't have family money, and was more focused on my career than on domestic pursuits. But over time, she'd seemed to warm up to me, especially after Jonas and I married and bought the house. The house. That should have been my first real warning sign. When we'd started looking for a place after the wedding, Patricia had been instrumental in the search. She'd found the property, negotiated with the sellers, and even helped with the down payment, a wedding gift, she'd called it, though it came with strings I hadn't understood at the time. She'd insisted on being added to the deed as a co-owner, just for tax purposes, she'd explained, and Jonas had backed her up. I'd been uncomfortable with the arrangement but had trusted their judgment. Now I wondered what other financial entanglements she'd woven around us while I'd been focused on building my career and our marriage. The job situations had been another red flag I'd missed. Twice in the past year, I'd been approached by headhunters about positions that would have required extensive travel or relocation. Both times, Jonas had been enthusiastic about the opportunities, encouraging me to pursue them, even though they would have meant significant disruption to our life together. Patricia had been equally supportive, talking about how these positions could set my career trajectory, and how young people needed to take risks while they could. At the time, I'd been touched by their support for my professional ambitions. Now I wondered if they'd been trying to engineer my absence from their lives. Then there were the comments about children that had started even before I got pregnant. Patricia would make observations about couples we knew who'd had babies, noting how the women seemed overwhelmed or not like themselves anymore. She'd point out friends whose careers had stalled after having children, whose marriages had become strained, whose entire identities had been subsumed by motherhood. I thought she was being realistic about the challenges of parenting, maybe preparing me for what to expect. Now I realized she'd been methodically undermining my confidence in my ability to be both a mother and a successful professional. The most insidious part was how she'd done it all with apparent love and concern. Every undermining comment had been wrapped in care, every manipulation disguised as helpful advice. She'd positioned herself as the wise elder, the experienced mother who'd navigated these challenges herself and wanted to spare me from making mistakes. And I'd bought it completely, even feeling grateful for her involvement and guidance. But I hadn't been entirely passive during this time. Something in my professional training had kicked in over the past few months, a subtle awareness that things weren't quite adding up. So I'd made some quiet moves, taking precautions I'd told myself were just responsible planning but that now seemed prescient. I'd opened a separate bank account under my maiden name, one that Jonas didn't know about, and had been depositing a portion of my paychecks there for the past 4 months. I told myself it was for surprise baby expenses or emergency savings, but really it had been an insurance policy against exactly this kind of situation. The account now held almost $15,000. Enough to support myself for several months if needed. I'd also been documenting things more carefully than usual, a habit that came naturally to someone in my profession but that I'd applied more systematically to my personal life. I'd kept copies of all our important documents in a safety deposit box Patricia didn't know about, including the house deed, insurance policies, and marriage certificate. I'd photographed and digitally stored financial records, correspondence, and even some of the more unusual gifts and arrangements Patricia had made over the years. Most importantly, I'd maintained my professional network and reputation carefully throughout the pregnancy. While Patricia had been subtly suggesting that my career was effectively over once the baby arrived, I'd been quietly reinforcing my relationships with colleagues, clients, and industry contacts. I'd taken on complex cases during my pregnancy, proving that my analytical skills were as sharp as ever, and had negotiated a flexible work arrangement that would allow me to maintain my caseload after the baby arrived. I'd also upgraded our home security system 6 weeks ago, ostensibly for baby safety but really because I'd started feeling uneasy about Patricia's level of access to our house. She had keys, knew our schedules, and had been dropping by unannounced more frequently. The new system included cameras and audio recording capabilities that she didn't know about, all accessible through my phone. The baby monitor conversation had been captured not just on my phone, but also by the house security system, creating multiple copies of evidence that would be difficult to dispute or destroy. Looking back now with Patricia's words still echoing in my mind, I realized my subconscious had been preparing for exactly this moment. Some part of me had sensed the danger even when my conscious mind was still trusting and hopeful. Those precautionary measures hadn't been paranoia. They'd been survival instincts kicking in just in time. As I continued folding baby clothes, maintaining the appearance of domestic tranquility while my husband watched me from the doorway, I felt those preparations clicking into place like pieces of armor. Patricia and Jonas might think they had all the advantages. They'd had months to plan this, they knew each other's intentions, and they assumed I was a naive, trusting wife who would go along with whatever they suggested. But they'd underestimated me in the most fundamental way possible. They'd forgotten that I made my living exposing deceptions and protecting people from financial predators. They'd overlooked the fact that my professional success was built on my ability to think several steps ahead of people who thought they were smarter than me. Most critically, they'd failed to understand what they were threatening. This wasn't just about my convenience or comfort anymore. This was about my child, my daughter, the life growing inside me that I was already fiercely devoted to protecting, and that gave me a strength and clarity I'd never accessed before, a willingness to do whatever was necessary to ensure her safety and future. Standing in that nursery, surrounded by all the preparations I'd made for her arrival, I began to understand that the real preparations were just beginning. The next morning, after Jonas left for work with a kiss that felt like a betrayal against my cheek, I sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and began making phone calls. The first was to Dr. Jennifer Reynolds, my obstetrician, ostensibly to schedule the appointment Jonas had suggested, but really to create a documented timeline of medical care, and to ensure there was a record of my pregnancy status and health. "Sarah, it's wonderful to hear from you," Dr. Reynolds said warmly. "How are you feeling at 32 weeks? Any concerns?" Her genuine care was a sharp contrast to the manipulation I'd been experiencing at home, and I had to steady my voice before responding. "I'm feeling well, thank you. Actually, I'm calling because my husband suggested we discuss our options regarding the pregnancy. I wanted to make sure I understand all the medical considerations." I kept my tone neutral, professional, but made sure to use Jonas's exact phrasing. There was a pause on the line. "Sarah, I want to make sure I understand what you're asking. At 32 weeks, with a healthy pregnancy like yours, the only options would be regarding birth planning and postpartum care. Are you experiencing any complications or concerns that I should know about?" "No complications that I'm aware of," I said carefully, "but I've been getting some pressure from family members about alternative approaches. I'd like to have a clear medical opinion on record about the viability and health of the pregnancy, and what our actual options are at this stage." Dr. Reynolds' voice sharpened with professional concern. "Sarah, I need to be very clear about this. At 32 weeks, with a healthy fetus and no maternal complications, terminating the pregnancy would not be medically indicated and would be extremely dangerous for you. Moreover, it would be illegal in Washington state except in cases of severe maternal risk or fetal abnormalities incompatible with life. Is someone suggesting you pursue termination at this stage?" I felt a wave of relief at her clear, professional response. "Yes, that suggestion has been made. I want to make sure I have medical documentation of the pregnancy's status and the legal parameters around any decisions. I'm going to schedule you for an appointment this week, and I'm going to document this conversation thoroughly. Sarah, if you're feeling pressured or unsafe in any way, there are resources I can connect you with. What you're describing could constitute a form of coercive control or abuse." The word abuse hit me like a revelation. I'd been thinking in terms of betrayal and manipulation, but Dr. Reynolds was right. Attempting to coerce a woman into terminating a wanted pregnancy was indeed a form of abuse. "I would appreciate any information about resources," I said. "And yes, please document everything carefully." My second call was to my supervisor at work, Tom Walls, no relation despite the shared surname. Tom had been a mentor to me since I joined the firm, and his expertise in forensic investigation had shaped my own professional development. More importantly, he was one of the few people who knew about my methodical approach to evidence gathering and my instincts for uncovering deception. "Sarah, good to hear from you. How's the pregnancy going? Still planning to work right up until delivery?" His familiarity and professional respect were exactly what I needed. "That's actually what I'm calling about, Tom. I'm dealing with some personal situations that might require my investigative skills, and I wanted to run them by you confidentially." I outlined the situation in broad strokes, framing it as a potential case of financial coercion and manipulation. Tom listened without interruption, then was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, what you're describing sounds like it could involve several areas of potential legal violation: coercive control, financial fraud if there are property manipulation involved, and possibly conspiracy if multiple parties are working together to pressure you. Have you considered consulting with a family law attorney?" That was going to be my next call, I admitted. "But I wanted to talk to you first about evidence preservation and investigation techniques. If this goes legal, I want to make sure I've documented everything properly." Smart thinking. Here's what I recommend. Continue documenting everything, but make sure you're doing it legally. Since it's your own home and your own conversations being recorded, you're on solid ground there. Keep multiple copies of everything in different locations. And Sarah, consider bringing in professional help sooner rather than later. What you're describing isn't just a family dispute. If someone is pressuring you to terminate a pregnancy through deception or coercion, that's serious enough to warrant law enforcement involvement. My third call was to Rebecca Morrison, a family law attorney I'd met through a case we'd worked together the previous year. She specialized in complex divorce cases involving financial manipulation and hidden assets. Exactly the kind of expertise I suspected I might need. Rebecca, this is Sarah Walls-Martinez. I worked with you on the Holloway case last year. I'm hoping I can hire you for a consultation on a personal matter. I appreciated that she remembered me immediately and was willing to fit me in that afternoon. Her office was in a downtown high-rise with views of Elliott Bay, the kind of space that projected competence and discretion. Rebecca herself was sharp-eyed and direct, the kind of attorney who'd built her practice on protecting people from exactly the kind of manipulation I was experiencing. "Tell me everything," she said simply, and I did. I played the recording from the baby monitor, showed her the documentation I'd been keeping, and outlined the financial entanglements Patricia had created over the years. Rebecca took notes without judgment, asking pointed questions about timelines, witnesses, and evidence. "Sarah, what you're describing is deeply concerning on multiple levels," she said when I finished. "First, the attempt to coerce you into terminating your pregnancy could constitute criminal coercion under Washington law. Second, the financial arrangements your mother-in-law has created around your property and assets suggest a pattern of financial abuse and potential fraud. Third, your husband's participation in this suggests conspiracy and potentially gives you grounds for divorce with cause if you choose to pursue that." She leaned forward, her expression serious. "But I want to be clear about something else. The level of control and manipulation you're describing, combined with the escalation to attempting to coerce pregnancy termination, suggests this could become dangerous. People who are willing to go this far to control someone's reproductive choices often escalate to other forms of control or violence when their initial tactics fail." The word dangerous sent a chill through me. I'd been thinking of this as a legal and financial problem to solve, but Rebecca was right to point out the potential for physical escalation. "What do you recommend?" "We need to move quickly on multiple fronts. I'm going to connect you with a colleague who specializes in reproductive coercion cases. This is more common than you might think, and there are specific legal protections available. We're also going to start documenting the financial manipulation for potential asset protection and recovery. And I strongly recommend you consider involving law enforcement sooner rather than later." By the time I left Rebecca's office, I had a clear action plan and a team of professionals who understood the gravity of the situation. More importantly, I had confirmation that my instincts were correct. This wasn't a family disagreement that could be resolved through communication or compromise. This was a systematic attempt to control and manipulate me that had escalated to threats against my unborn child. The investigation that followed over the next 2 weeks was methodical and thorough, conducted with the same attention to detail I brought to my professional cases but with far higher personal stakes. With Rebecca's guidance and Dr. Reynolds's medical documentation, I began building a comprehensive case that would protect both me and my daughter. The first breakthrough came when Rebecca's colleague, Amanda Foster, who specialized in reproductive coercion, introduced me to a detective with the Seattle Police Department who worked on domestic violence and coercive control cases. Detective Maria Santos had seen cases like mine before and knew exactly what evidence would be needed if we decided to pursue criminal charges. "The pattern you're describing is classic," Detective Santos explained during our meeting. "Financial entanglement to create dependency, isolation from support systems, and then escalation to reproductive control. The fact that they're suggesting late-term termination shows a level of desperation that suggests they're working against some kind of deadline." That observation led to the second major breakthrough. With Detective Santos's help, we began investigating Patricia's background more thoroughly, something I realized I'd never done despite being married to her son for 3 years. What we found was disturbing. Patricia had been married twice after Jonas's father left. Both marriages had ended in contentious divorces where the men claimed she'd manipulated them financially and used their children as leverage. In one case, her second husband had filed for a restraining order, claiming she'd threatened to harm his daughter from a previous marriage if he didn't give her what she wanted. The restraining order had been granted but had expired years ago. More significantly, we discovered that Patricia had declared bankruptcy 7 years earlier, wiping out significant debts that included loans she'd taken against property she didn't fully own. The pattern suggested someone who was comfortable using deception and manipulation to solve financial problems, and who had a history of involving children in her schemes. This explains the urgency, Rebecca observed when we reviewed the findings. If she's in financial trouble again, she might see your baby as a threat to her control over Jonas and his resources. A grandchild would shift family dynamics and potentially expose her financial dependence. The third breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Reynolds, who had been concerned about the pressure I was receiving, had consulted with colleagues about similar cases. She connected me with Dr. Sarah Kim, a psychiatrist who specialized in family dysfunction and manipulation. What you're describing sounds like a pattern of narcissistic control, Dr. Kim explained during our consultation. The mother-in-law has positioned herself as central to her son's life and identity. Your pregnancy represents a fundamental threat to that arrangement, not just because of the baby itself, but because becoming a mother will likely give you strength and clarity that makes you harder to manipulate. Dr. Kim's analysis helped me understand why Patricia's behavior had escalated so dramatically during my pregnancy. It wasn't just about the practical implications of having a grandchild. It was about the threat my evolving identity posed to her control over our family dynamics. But the most significant discovery came when Detective Santos obtained a warrant to examine Patricia's financial records as part of the investigation into potential coercive control. What they found exceeded even my worst suspicions. Patricia had been systematically draining assets from our joint accounts and property for over a year, using her position on the house deed to take out loans and credit lines Jonas and I knew nothing about. She'd accumulated over $80,000 in debt against our property, money she'd used to cover her own expenses and lifestyle. Worse, she'd been planning to sell our house, to cover her debts. A transaction that would have left Jonas and me homeless with a new baby. The financial manipulation explained everything. Patricia wasn't just concerned about losing control over Jonas. She was facing financial ruin that would be exposed once we started making major decisions as new parents. Our baby represented not just an emotional threat to her control, but a practical threat to her financial scheme. This is fraud, plain and simple, Rebecca said when we reviewed the financial evidence. She's used her position on your deed to steal from you, and she's used coercion and deception to hide it. We have grounds for both criminal charges and civil recovery. Detective Santos agreed. We've got enough evidence to proceed with charges for financial fraud, coercive control, and conspiracy. The recorded conversation about pregnancy termination, combined with the financial fraud, paints a clear picture of systematic abuse. But even as we built our legal case, Patricia and Jonas continued their pressure campaign, unaware that I was documenting everything. Jonas had become increasingly insistent about the appointment with Dr. Reynolds, and Patricia had started dropping by the house more frequently, always with new articles about the challenges of late pregnancy and the risks of having a baby in uncertain financial times. The most chilling moment came when Patricia arrived one afternoon with what she claimed was information about pregnancy termination options. She'd printed out materials from out-of-state clinics, highlighting procedures that would be available to someone in their second trimester. She presented this as research she'd done to help me understand my options, but the level of detail and the specific contacts she'd found made it clear this wasn't casual internet browsing. "I've even spoken to someone about scheduling," she said with a concerned expression that didn't match the calculating look in her eyes. "They can fit you in next week if you decide to move forward. The longer you wait, the more complicated and expensive it becomes." I listened to her describe the logistics of terminating my pregnancy with the same careful attention I gave to financial criminals explaining their embezzlement schemes. The casual way she discussed handling the arrangements and managing the aftermath revealed someone who had thought through every detail of a plan that would eliminate my child and solve her financial problems simultaneously. "That's very thorough research," I said calmly, accepting the papers she offered. "I'll discuss it with Jonas and Dr. Reynolds." But internally, I was recording every word and adding this evidence to the growing case file that would soon expose her completely. The evening after Patricia's clinic visit, I had the conversation with Jonas that would determine the future of our marriage. I'd prepared carefully, ensuring the house security system was recording, and that I had backup devices capturing audio. I'd also arranged for Detective Santos to be on standby in case the conversation escalated in a dangerous direction. "Jonas," I said as we sat down to dinner, "I've been thinking about your mother's suggestions regarding the pregnancy. I'd like to understand exactly what you think we should do. I kept my voice neutral, giving him room to reveal his true position without being confrontational. He looked uncomfortable, shifting in his chair before answering. Well, Mom has some good points about the timing and our financial situation. Maybe we should consider whether we're really ready for this responsibility. His words were careful, rehearsed, but his body language revealed the discomfort of someone being asked to advocate for something he wasn't entirely convinced of. What specific concerns do you have about our financial situation? I asked, genuinely curious to see how much he knew about his mother's fraud. Mom showed me some numbers about the costs of raising a child, and with the house payments and everything. He trailed off, unable to meet my eyes. It was clear he didn't understand the real financial situation any better than I had 6 months ago. Jonas, do you know how much debt we're currently carrying? I asked directly. He looked puzzled. The mortgage and our credit cards, but that's pretty manageable. Mom helped us structure everything to minimize our monthly obligations. It was in that moment I realized Jonas was as much a victim of his mother's manipulation as I was, though his victimization didn't excuse his willingness to pressure me into terminating our pregnancy. He genuinely didn't understand that his mother had been systematically defrauding us, but he was willing to go along with her recommendations without questioning them or considering the impact on me. Jonas, I need you to understand something, I said, maintaining my calm tone despite the gravity of what I was about to reveal. Your mother has taken out over $80,000 in loans against our house without our knowledge. She's been using her position on the deed to access credit that we're legally responsible for. We're not in a good financial position because of normal expenses. We're in trouble because she's been stealing from us. The shock on his face was genuine, but it was quickly followed by defensiveness. That's impossible. Mom would never do anything like that. She's been helping us, making sure we make good financial decisions. I pulled out copies of the financial documents Detective Santos had obtained, spreading them across the kitchen table. These are the loan documents with her signature, Jonas. These are the account statements showing where the money went. This is the evidence. He stared at the papers for a long time, and I watched his worldview crumble as he processed what he was seeing. His mother, the woman who'd raised him and protected him and guided his major life decisions, had been systematically betraying the family she claimed to be helping. But why would she? He started, then stopped, unable to complete the thought. Because she's in financial trouble and she's been using us to solve it, I said simply. And our baby represents a threat to her control over that arrangement. The conversation that followed was long and painful, but ultimately revealed that Jonas had been as manipulated as I had been. His agreement to pressure me about the pregnancy had come from his lifelong pattern of trusting his mother's judgment without question, not from any independent desire to harm our child. When confronted with evidence of her deception, he was genuinely horrified and immediately wanted to know how to fix the situation. What do we do? He asked, his voice shaking with a combination of anger and betrayal. We hold her accountable, I said, legally, financially, and personally. And we make sure she never has the opportunity to manipulate our family again. But even as Jonas came to terms with his mother's betrayal, Patricia was accelerating her own timeline. The day after my conversation with Jonas, she called to say she'd made an appointment for me at one of the out-of-state clinics she'd researched. She'd used her medical emergency contact status, another arrangement I hadn't fully understood the implications of, to schedule what she described as a consultation, but which was clearly intended to pressure me into an immediate procedure. The appointment is tomorrow morning, she announced when she called. Jonas and I will drive you. It's better to handle these things quickly and discreetly. The casual assumption that I would go along with her plan, that she could schedule medical procedures for me without my consent, that my husband would participate in forcing me to terminate my pregnancy, was breathtaking in its audacity. But it was also the final evidence I needed to demonstrate the level of control and coercion I was experiencing. Patricia, I said calmly, I need you to cancel that appointment. I haven't agreed to any procedures, and I don't appreciate you making medical arrangements for me without my permission. There was a long pause before she responded, and when she did, her voice had lost all pretense of maternal concern. Sarah, you need to think about what's best for everyone here. This pregnancy is going to ruin your career, destroy your marriage, and leave you with responsibilities you're not prepared for. I'm trying to help you avoid a mistake that will affect the rest of your life. The only mistake I see, I replied, is trusting someone who would steal from her own family and then try to coerce them into terminating a wanted pregnancy to cover up the theft. The silence that followed was electric with tension. When Patricia spoke again, her voice was sharp with a fury I'd never heard before. You have no idea what you're talking about, Sarah. I've protected this family for years, made sacrifices you couldn't begin to understand. If you're not willing to make the smart choice here, you're going to destroy everything I've built. What you've built, I said, is a house of cards constructed on lies and theft, and it's about to come down. The threat in her voice when she responded was unmistakable. If you continue down this path, Sarah, you're going to find out exactly how much control I have over your life. Jonas will choose his mother over his wife, the house will be sold to cover our debts, and you'll be left with nothing. Nothing except a baby you can't afford to raise alone. It was the confession I'd been waiting for. The explicit acknowledgement of both her financial fraud and her willingness to use coercion and threats to maintain control. But more than that, it was a declaration of war. A statement that she was prepared to escalate to any level necessary to get what she wanted. Patricia, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me, I think you're going to be very surprised by how much control you actually have. The confrontation I'd been preparing for came sooner than expected. The morning after my phone conversation with Patricia, she arrived at the house unannounced, using her key to enter while Jonas was at work. I heard the front door open and close, followed by her voice calling out as if nothing unusual had happened. Sarah, honey, are you ready to go? The appointment is in 2 hours and we need to get on the road. I was in the nursery, putting the finishing touches on the room that had become a symbol of everything I was fighting to protect. The absurdity of her expectation, that I would simply go along with her plan after our conversation the previous day, would have been funny if it weren't so deeply disturbing. I'm up here, Patricia, I called down, buying myself a few moments to activate the security system and alert Detective Santos that the confrontation was beginning. I'd been prepared for this moment for weeks, but the reality of it still sent my heart racing. She climbed the stairs with purpose, her heels clicking against the hardwood with the rhythm of someone who expected to be obeyed. When she appeared in the nursery doorway, her expression was carefully composed, the mask of concerned mother-in-law back in place. What a lovely room, she said, looking around at the preparations I'd made. It's such a shame to waste all this work. The casual cruelty of the comment, delivered while surrounded by tiny clothes and baby furniture, revealed more about her character than hours of conversation could have. I don't think it's a waste, I said calmly, continuing to arrange books on the shelf. I'm looking forward to reading these to my daughter. Sarah, we need to be realistic about this situation, Patricia said, stepping into the room. I've made arrangements to help you, but they can't wait indefinitely. If you don't take advantage of this opportunity, you're going to find yourself in a very difficult position. I turned to face her directly, my hand resting on my belly where my daughter was awake and moving. What kind of difficult position? Financial ruin for starters, she said bluntly. Do you have any idea how much debt you and Jonas are carrying? How precarious your situation really is. Adding a baby to that equation isn't just irresponsible. It's cruel to the child. Tell me about the debt, Patricia, I said. Explain to me exactly how we accumulated $80,000 in obligations I knew nothing about. The change in her expression was immediate and telling. The practiced concern evaporated, replaced by calculation and growing alarm. I don't know what you think you've discovered, Sarah, but you're clearly confused about our financial arrangements. I'm not confused at all, I said, pulling out copies of the loan documents from the dresser drawer. I have all the paperwork right here. Your signatures, your applications, your lies to the lenders about property ownership and income. All of it. She stared at the documents for a long moment, and I watched her recalculate her approach. When she looked back at me, the mask was completely gone, replaced by a cold fury that revealed her true nature. You have no idea what you're messing with, she said, her voice low and dangerous. I've spent years building the life Jonas has, protecting him from mistakes like the one you're determined to make. I won't let you destroy everything because you're too selfish and naive to make the right choice. The right choice for who? I asked. For you? For your financial scheme? Because it's certainly not the right choice for my daughter. Your daughter? Patricia laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. Sarah, you can't even protect yourself from your own stupidity. What makes you think you can protect a child? You're about to lose your house, your husband, and your financial security. Adding a baby to that situation is the definition of child abuse. It was in that moment, standing in the nursery I'd prepared with such hope and love, listening to my mother-in-law threaten my unborn child while surrounded by the evidence of her own fraud and manipulation, that I fully understood the scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't a family disagreement or a difference of opinion about timing. This was a predator who had systematically infiltrated and exploited my family, and who was now threatening the most vulnerable member of that family to protect her own interests. Patricia, I said, my voice carrying a steel I'd never accessed before, you need to leave my house. Now. Your house. She smiled, an expression that held no humor. Sarah, I own a third of this house. I have every right to be here and every right to protect my investment. If you're not willing to be reasonable about this pregnancy situation, I'll find other ways to solve the problem. The threat was implicit but clear, and it crystallized everything I'd been preparing for over the past weeks. This woman was willing to do whatever was necessary to maintain control over her son and protect her financial scheme, up to and including threats against my unborn child. Actually, Patricia, I said, reaching for my phone, you're wrong about several things. First, you don't own any part of this house anymore. The fraud investigation has resulted in a lien that freezes your access to the property. Second, you don't have the right to be here because your key access was revoked yesterday as part of the protective order. And third, you're not going to solve any problems because Detective Santos is on her way up the stairs right now. The sound of footsteps on the stairs wasn't Patricia's imagination. I'd been coordinating with law enforcement throughout the confrontation, and Detective Santos had been waiting outside for the conversation to reach the point where formal intervention was necessary. Patricia Martinez, Detective Santos said as she appeared in the nursery doorway, you're under arrest for financial fraud, coercive control, and criminal harassment. You have the right to remain silent. The arrest was swift and professional, but Patricia's fury was evident even as she was handcuffed. This isn't over, Sarah, she said as Detective Santos led her toward the stairs. You have no idea what you've started. Jonas will never forgive you for this, and you'll spend the rest of your life regretting the choices you've made today. The only thing I regret, I replied, is not recognizing who you really were sooner. As the police car pulled away from my house, I stood in the nursery window, one hand on my belly and the other holding the phone that had just recorded Patricia's threats and confessions. The immediate crisis was over, but I knew the real work of rebuilding and recovery was just beginning. The legal proceedings that followed were thorough and swift. Patricia was charged with multiple counts of fraud, coercive control, and criminal harassment. The evidence we gathered over the weeks of investigation was overwhelming, and her own recorded statements provided clear confirmation of both her financial crimes and her attempts to coerce me into terminating my pregnancy. Jonas, confronted with undeniable evidence of his mother's manipulation and fraud, chose to cooperate fully with the investigation and to sever all financial and personal ties with her. The process was painful for him, but ultimately liberating as he began to understand the extent to which his entire adult life had been shaped by her control and deception. The house was saved through a combination of asset recovery from Patricia's accounts and a refinancing arrangement that removed her from all ownership and decision-making. The debt she'd accumulated was partially recovered and partially forgiven as part of the criminal restitution process. Most importantly, Dr. Reynolds continued to monitor my pregnancy closely, and my daughter was born healthy and strong 6 weeks after Patricia's arrest. Jonas was present for the delivery, having worked through his own trauma and recommitted himself to our marriage and family. The broader impact of the case extended beyond our personal situation. Detective Santos used our case as part of a larger investigation into financial fraud schemes targeting family members, and Patricia's methods were used to identify and prevent similar crimes against other families. Dr. Foster, the reproductive coercion specialist, used our case in training programs to help other healthcare providers recognize and respond to similar situations. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the transformation in my own understanding of my strength and capabilities. The experience of protecting my daughter from threats, even before she was born, revealed reserves of determination and strategic thinking I hadn't known I possessed. It changed not just how I approached my family life, but how I understood my own power and responsibility. 6 months after Sophia was born, as I rocked her to sleep in the nursery where I'd first heard the threats against her life, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to safety. The woman who had stood in this room folding baby clothes while listening to plans for her child's elimination felt like a different person from the one who now held her healthy, thriving daughter. I'd learned that trust without verification is dangerous, that family relationships can be weaponized by those who understand how to exploit love and loyalty, and that protecting the vulnerable sometimes requires being willing to sacrifice comfort and maintaining the status quo. Most importantly, I'd learned that maternal instincts, combined with professional skills and community support, could overcome even systematic deception and manipulation. Patricia was ultimately sentenced to 4 years in prison in order to pay full restitution for the financial fraud. She never apologized or acknowledged the harm she'd caused, maintaining until the end that she'd been trying to protect her family from a mistake that would have ruined their lives. But as I looked down at my sleeping daughter, healthy and safe and surrounded by love, I knew the only mistake would have been listening to someone who valued control more than life, manipulation more than love, and her own interests more than the well-being of an innocent child. The smile that had started it all, the calm, controlled expression I'd maintained while planning Patricia's downfall, had been replaced by genuine joy. My daughter was safe, my family was rebuilt on foundations of honesty and mutual respect, and I discovered strengths I never knew I possessed. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with anger or confrontation, but with patience, planning, and the quiet determination to protect what matters most. And sometimes the most powerful weapon against those who would harm the innocent is simply refusing to be the victim they expect you to be.